Welcome to StoryTalk, 1 week critiques roundtable appreciating short fiction a single story at a time. My name is Adam al-Sirgany, and I'm here today with Matthew Schmidt
Hello.
and 1 week critiques own birthday girl Ingrid Wenzler.
Hi.
And today we're discussing a piece from Roy Kesey's book All Over. Today's story is Wait, which is the tale of a number of folks hanging out in an airport, perpetually delayed and incapable of getting to the various, really many places that they're going. Wait deals only in characters who are named by either their regional or local,
National.
nationalities, their jobs, sometimes both, a few small qualities about them. And it has an odd trajectory. It's sort of about people sitting and getting to know each other from an early Wait, and then it devolves into ever more extremism. It primarily, I think, follows the character of the accountant, but also a Bulgarian poet, a small boy, and various nationalist groups. I feel like I probably haven't hit on all of it, in part because it's a story that's a little bit angular. Did I miss anything that you feel like folks should know about off the bat?
Well, I think maybe you could talk a little bit about what you think angular means in this particular instance.
Yeah, so I think that by angular, I mean that the story isn't focusing on a singular protagonist. Those protagonists don't necessarily have individual desires that we're tracking throughout the story, so it's both not an individual person that we're following, that individual person isn't on some kind of specific quest. The other day I interviewed Valerie Vogren, and she had said about a character in her story, The Dotted Line, that the character is a sort of traditional story insofar as the character has to make a single decision, which happens to be choosing to continue her lease or not, and that creates an organic timeline on which the story begins and ends. This story has a seemingly organic timeline insofar as the plane should be taking these people to destinations where they separate. Notably, we don't know where they're going, and we don't know exactly where in the world they are, but we never actually get that information. Instead, and the plane itself never takes off throughout the story. So we learn about the various characters through the way they behave in an extreme situation where an immediate bad weather delay turns into another kind of bad weather delay, turns into a bizarre moment where a meteor ostensibly hits the airport, and things devolve from there. And so individual desires evolve over time, and they change over time, and how these people interact and understand and communicate with each other evolves over time. And I think that's what I mean by angularity, when we get all of that largely without interiority, a little bit of interiority on the part of the accountant and a couple other figures. I think that the story itself, too, is... I mentioned to both of you that it's a little bit, I think, both magical realist and maybe postmodern, which I think always have had a certain amount of connection. I'd made notes to myself that said, one part Marquez and one part Robert Coover about this story. And I think to that angularity, I think that's part of those traditions, but I wondered if either of you had thoughts about the relevance of those traditions or the traditions you see entering into that piece at all?
Well, I'm probably the least qualified at this table to speak to that. Just in that I haven't read Marquez or Coover at all. I'd really like to. But I mean, I guess what I would say about genre tradition and its relevance to this story is I think, as with any story, it of course deepens your understanding of the story to know the other work that it's conversant with. But I think it's a story that absolutely stands on its own. You don't have to know that history to read the story and take pleasure in it. I think the other thing that I would say, though, is that, as with any story, it's important to meet the work and its intentions, and be aware of those intentions, what it's trying to do. So, I mean, I think while I don't know Marquez or Coover, what I do know is that this story isn't trying to be like a Richard Ford story, for example. You could call it realist, which is a very broad term, but I think it's handling its characters and its sense of reality very, very differently.
I guess when I think about genre, I don't want to think about genre. and not because, I dislike genre per se, in the fact that, like, when we're in the mood for something, right, we're in the mood for that one thing. And, we want to go select a story or a film or something in that genre because, for whatever reason, we would like to see or read something particular. However, when I come to a story, I come particularly not knowing the author beforehand. I try to come with an open mind. And, you've mentioned already 2 different possible genres that this might fit into. And so I think I want to read a story in the way that it unfolds and not be thinking so much necessarily about the genre. Maybe that has to do with anti-capitalist sentiments. I don't know.
Yeah.
However, right, like, the story can still construct its world using multiple genres. And so, in competent hands, right, I am free to ride with the story so long as the story doesn't break down in some manner. And so, while yes, I think it's important to know or to consider what the genre is and how the story is operating, either using those tenets or playing against those tenets, I also think about the way literature is moving in the world. And this book came out in 2007, and it seems even more recently there is more and more of a breakdown in genre. There are more and more calls for manuscripts that have multiple genres, even if it's prose and poetry, or paintings and prose, or what have you, And so, in some respect, I want to sit here and embrace the world so long as the world, contains itself.
Sure. I think that for me there's a real relevance to understanding that kind of progression that you're talking about. So that, right, like when Lydia Davis sort of hit the scene, there's significantly less of the kind of work that Roy Kesey is doing. And I think in some ways she sort of defines this particular brand of story that lives in that space of the surreal, not because necessarily of its surreality, although there's a lot of surreality in Roy Kesey's work, whether it's waiting people deciding to have a kind of airport Olympics by, moving trash cans around and having races and stuff, or whether it's, a group of people stealing an airplane to take off and get away, or a meteor hitting the airport, which none of which are impossible in and of themselves, but that do live in these spaces of how we act as individuals who are also defined in some ways by being an accountant or being, the poet, and so on and so forth. I think one thing I'm really interested in that you said, Matthew, is that you're interested in how the world itself sits. I know that we talked before this a little bit about sentence structure, which matters a lot to you as a person, as a poet, as a reader. So while we're thinking out the way in which this story works on a broad level, let's bring it in from the big abstract, the genre categories, and the history of other work that might situate what Roy Kesey's up to. Let's talk a little bit about this sentence, this sentence, this sentence, and how the work moves.
Yeah, I mean, we had previously discussed a little bit about my first read of this story. I wasn't a big fan necessarily of the sentence construction, mostly because it was almost completely declarative sentences. So in a way, it kind of feels like, you're getting information without emotion in some respects.
Yeah.
And, I've since read it a couple more times, and the actual beef I have with those sentences has gone down a bit.
Yeah.
But again, that's me, like, being able to go into that world. But when we think about the sentences, it's basically, a report of what happens in this airport over time. And possibly the thing that was getting to me is that, right, the same things happen. And that is part of the story and part of the reason for the story. However, it's like we get the people waiting for the airplane, we get the delay, we get what the people do in response to the delay. And that happens over and over and over again, right? That's basically what the story does. And as you've noted, it increasingly gets weirder and farther out there. And I think part of what the story is looking at, right, is how people interact socially, particularly in a place where lots of nationalities and types of people come together.
Sure.
And, it's also looking at what different types of people's reactions are to their plans being delayed, missing the people they care for, something happens with their job, they can't go to their job, right? The whole story, though, right, it's insular insofar as no one hardly ever leaves the airport except for the first night, when some people that are locals are able to go home and come back, and later when certain people break out of the airport, steal an airplane, and attempt to get away. And so you're stuck with nothing changing in the particular scenery, only what is changing within the characters themselves, right? We're constantly running out of food, we're running out of places to sleep, it's uncomfortable, you only know maybe a few people if you're lucky, some people don't know anyone, right? And so I think the story's sentences do a good job of interrogating those interactions.
Yeah.
On the flip side, like, maybe I am more interested in beautiful sentences, and that was partially my dislike of those type of formulations the first time I read it.
So maybe we can look at some examples of what you mean by declarative then.
Yeah, I actually had opened it up and I was going to give a few examples of some things that happen. So the bar is constantly running out of different things. So a bar that runs short of ice negotiates with another that's run short of napkins. But they're also, so you get that again and again as a recurring thing in different ways. At one point, the bars run out of gin, out of swizzle sticks. But you also get a lot of lines like this. Other passengers stir and scratch, children whine. Let's see, night closes in. Just a subject followed by a verb or two verbs and, a conjunction between them. I think I actually had a really similar response reading it to Matthew first time around, where I think some of the repetition made it hard for me to get into it. I didn't think the sentences, like there was nothing editorially I would change about them at all. They're simple, they're tight, they're strong in a lot of ways. I think what started to bother me is I had a professor in college who used to talk about what she called the imitative fallacy, and she used to describe it this way. She would say that, if a character is bored, you can't have the reader be bored also. You have to convey that boredom, but also find a way around it. I think some of the repetition was making me feel trapped in the airport with those characters, which is really artful. I think, though, like Matthew, in reading this, I recognized my own biases and, was thinking a lot about meeting the story on its own terms and getting excited about what it wanted to do. And, I think the part of the story where I got most excited was the ending. I thought, I felt something. I usually want to feel something in stories. I think it's a very funny story, which was largely lost on me. I'm curious to hear you guys talk a little bit about absurdism at some point.
Yeah, I think that it is an absurd story, right? And it relies a lot on that. I'm interested in your idea about the imitative fallacy.
Yeah.
Among the reasons that I think I always appreciated the sentences because they feel very journalistic to me.
Yeah.
And they use good verbs, but they're very direct. I'm never confused about who's doing what, despite the many different people that we're maneuvering. And I think they also, those sentences, apart from being declarative, are often describing collectives. They're talking about groups. And I know I keep coming back to that, but I think especially in sort of what I'm hoping are the late days of a pandemic, that has drawn a lot of attention nationally and internationally to not only the ways in which our governments do and don't protect us or create identifiers for us and identities for us, but also the ways in which race in America has developed, the way that we think about that, and has made us interact on those levels in sort of separate spaces. I think one interesting thing this story ends up doing is, as it amplifies, we're seeing not only increasing identification not of individuals but of national identities, but also we're seeing bureaucratization around the characters, right? They can't leave, and that is guarded by an actual kind of military apparatus, right? Like there are men standing outside with guns preventing them from maneuvering, and the way in which they change. And I think that this story, by presenting all of that in a journalistic fashion, kind of condenses the way that reading about global events can be, or even reading about local events if you're trapped in a house can be. And in some ways, I think that imitative fallacy works for me, and along with absurdism, I'm hoping we'll come back to the sort of surreal and filmic qualities of some of this stuff. And I think that does something remarkable. It does something strange, and it opens up things that I wouldn't have expected to happen. Which isn't to say that I think it would have been impossible to do that and start more sentences with gerund phrases, but I think it does make a choice to follow that idea of how we're going to encounter the world.
I think that's eloquently put, and I want to dig into something you're saying about characterization. I think there are the groupings that you're talking about in terms of national or international identity, but you also have characters that, I would think of as archetypal characters,
Sure.
Identified by their profession or where they're from, and I mean, that's really important to, like, the fairy tale, and, I think we'll talk a little bit about those characters and how we do and don't get to know them, and the way that actually that really does mirror reality in this case. Like, I don't think of it as being magical. In an airport, you often will know someone by their sweatshirt or the luggage they're carrying or dragging behind them, little things like that. It's kind of true to the experience in a funny way.
Yeah, I think for better or worse to also, right, like the identifiers of ethnic identity and the kind of characters that exist as a result of that. And I think the most giving way to describe how that is, right, like we've talked around a little bit. I believe it's a group of Cubans that commandeer the airplane or organize the commandeering of the airplane to escape. But also, right, like the accountant who we're primarily following is going to take off with a young woman who is black and African and who's like former like husband is a warlord. Right? He's going to come in and sort of terrorize the end situation. I think that's I think one thing that some of all of this ends up negotiating is how we're viewing that from the outside and how we're going to view that from the outside. And I think that is part of the complexity of what the story wants to engage in, and I want to think of that as something that it wants to engage in.
Yeah, the main character, if it can be said, he is the main character, is the accountant.
Sure.
And while the POV is not from the accountant's perspective, he's who we follow most closely. And so it's an absurd story from the beginning because he's an accountant of numbers and money and so on. And yet the particular POV of the story is an accounting of people and nationalities and so on, right? So like we're signaled that in the beginning. And I also think, right, there is a signaling of the absurd in the sentences, and the way it becomes funny is you say a thing over and over in a certain way, or you say different things over and over in the same way. As a reader, you're sitting there like taking it in. Okay, X happens. Okay, Y happens. Okay, Z happens. But like, the build-up of all of these things that happen, right, in that way you can make this sort of amalgamation of hysterics in what you're doing. And like, as has been pointed out, right, the groups of people are broken down into nationalities, and they run these Olympics and vie against each other for supremacy in whatever sport, with quotation marks around it, that they perform in the airport. And yet we focus on a little group of like 4 people.
Yeah.
possibly 5. And that is, right, we've got the accountant, who's Canadian. We've got the Honduran poet. We've got a Mongolian boy. And we have the woman from Ghana that the accountant eventually escapes with. And I think one of the most hilarious turns in the story is that the Mongolian boy has brought a checkerboard, and that's what he's playing with, while all the other kids are either playing with action figures of some sort or reading comic books, etc. And so late one night, deep into this wait, the poet elbows the accountant, points to the checkerboard protruding from the Mongolian boy's carry-on. 4 hours later, with the score 9-7 in favor of the accountant, the old Honduran woman asks if she might play as well. She wins the next 12 matches, falls asleep mid-move at dawn. Right, and this is hilarious because, right, it's people just trying to get by, and yet there's still a competition of sorts. Nonetheless, both the accountant and the poet think they're smart in certain ways, or at least are portrayed as smart in the story because they have these particular backgrounds. The Honduran woman is only given to us as old, right? And so you're thinking, or you're meant to think, that the Honduran woman's not going to win anything. And yet she wipes the floor with these two guys and falls asleep afterwards because, it's just a game to her. It's not, this is who I am.
Yeah. I think one thing that we haven't talked much about, but I think you're starting to get toward, is that, like, for all of this, right, like, you have the Belgian poet, you've got the accountant, you've got, this person, that person, and throughout the course of repetition, and I think it does come through repetition, right, because the sort of metonymic way in which people are identified within the story starts to turn toward knowing those people over and over and over. It's a little like watching a sitcom or something play out where you see a recurring extra or a figure only sort of comes in to use a catchphrase, but over time you see them do something slightly different, and in doing that you get to know something about them, or you get to ask a new question about them. I'm wondering, do you start to connect with the characters in the story through that process? Do you have thoughts on what that becomes for you in individual characters? Are there individual characters that you do latch on to or start to become familiar with and sort of root for throughout the course of the story in that way?
I was immediately partial to the Bulgarian poet. I thought he was charming, and, I liked the way that the joke with him was often that he'd be trying to think of some word for a crossword or a poem, and you'd get a beat, he'd get interrupted, and then it would occur to him suddenly. He'd come back. I think we're meant to feel charmed by him immediately. I think the accountant's a little harder to access, but I think, like Matthew's saying, in terms of language, that I almost get more interested in him, like, sort of intellectually after the fact. Like, so the opening line of this story is, "Waiting Lounge 19A and Wing D of Terminal 4 is precisely full."
Which is a bullshit line.
Which is a bullshit line, but it makes me think of it in a lot of different ways. First of all, it really reminds me of the opening line of The Dead, which is, Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally run off her feet.
Yeah.
I don't know if that echo is one I'm reaching for or not, but one where like you're immediately like, well, what does that mean precisely? Full? How can you literally be run off your feet? The literally is extraneous there. The precisely is confusing, especially if we're in an accountant's head. But I mean, I think I stop on it and I start to think, well, we're in the terminal. Is he counting the seats? Is that what he means by precisely, or is this just, overstatement? And I think like he becomes interesting to me in that way, oddly. Like the linguistic games become kind of funny and like a little puzzle.
Yeah, I'm thrown back to, I saw Brenda Mayer give a talk one time, and a teacher of ours, Timmy Nathanson, asked her about a book of hers beginning with the word stately.
Mm-hmm.
He had this theory that it was her speaking to the fact that she saw her work as being in conversation with Ulysses, stately Buck Mulligan. And I was surprised to find that she immediately just went, yeah, I just thought that I should say, I'm for Ulysses.
Oh my gosh.
Which I'm throwing back to you, but that said, tell me a little bit about a bullshit line.
Well, I mean, it's a bullshit line in a good and a bad way.
Yeah.
It's good in that it signals what kind of story this is going to be, right? As we've discussed, I think.
Yeah.
It's a crazy line in that it's not possible or it doesn't make sense, right? In the way that, as Ingrid has pointed out, it doesn't say precisely how. I think maybe what he gets away with here is why I call it a bullshit line. And that is that he's able to say everyone is here in this little ass terminal at the same time waiting to take this plane, meaning I'm going to throw in people from all over the world and we're going to see what happens. And right, like he plays it out in the sense that certain nationalities seem to follow what the popular thought is on that nationality, like who they are, what they do, what they're good at, what they're bad at. And yet we have these outlier characters that he puts in there to show that, no, in fact, people are people and they're individuals.
Yeah.
Right? So that's what he gets away with. And he does it in such a way as to, like, say what terminal it is. Like, you almost gloss over that.
You do.
Because you get to the precisely full. And you're like, you're just picturing any air terminal you've ever been in and thinking about what precisely full means. And they're all constructed differently, right? So he's like suggesting to us what he's going to cover in the story. And so in that way, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
And he's also pissing me off with the first line. Which,
Well, I mean,
which
I
is,
think, I think you're right that it's got a little bit of this infuriating quality about it, but it's so careful and I mean, he knows exactly what he's doing with that precisely in the same way that, I mean, I think thinking about character and when I start to feel something new about character is the end of the story. There's something about that last line that, like, I don't know, I was reading along, I was following all the jokes. I think this story is structured so much like a joke, and I think I come to that last line and I feel something totally new, and he does it with a word. The basket rises into the cold, wet gray, and the warlord weeps, aims, fires, misses, beautifully. I don't expect the beautifully from this story, from anything it gives me, and, with one word at the end, it kind of sweeps me off my feet and takes me to this new place and makes me realize, like, what I'm hoping for these characters, that they do get away. And, I think that's pretty cool.
Well, the construction of that sentence is completely different than everything else in the story, too.
Yeah.
It's the only time you have a running list with comments like that.
Yeah.
And that's him showing, like, I could have done that. I could have written beautifully.
Yeah.
But, like, that was not the point of this particular story.
Yeah, I think that as I was reading it, I actually like your phrasing, Ingrid, that it's written like a joke. For me, I spent a lot of time thinking about this story as the sort of aristocrat's joke of literary fiction, and that it builds and it builds and it builds and it gets increasingly and aggressively absurd, and then it has this flat, like, punchline of an ending. I think one way that it gets there is actually through a moment of kind of Deus Ex Machina. It goes way up and above and beyond, in that the Ghanan woman and the accountant are running around with the Mongolian boy. They're jumping over dead bodies as things collapse. Her ex, the warlord, turns up in the airport. The Belgian poet is Bulgarian poet is
No one can remember where he's from.
I remember that he's a poet because of his poety qualities with his crossword puzzles, but he's dying, and this kind of joke happens as he's dying of the smell of a particular food that the accountant is unfamiliar with, and they have the moment, and there's a hot air balloon to save them that sort of arrives. It's sort of it's like a Quentin Tarantino ending in some ways, right? Like the elevation of violence with some kind of grace emerging out of that. I think Ingrid's saying you want that grace. Yeah. I think I'm actually of another mind. That's the part of the story for me. At some point, I want it to all burn down, and it's like I've been thinking about that impulse a little bit.
I mean, that
and why
could be
that
differently interesting. I think in some ways, like, I mainly want something to happen. I want to get out of that waiting space in some way.
I think the hot air balloon is another, like, way for him to say, like, even though the world is shit, like, we can still ride on ideas and breath and talking to each other.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, that's true. And it also, like, points to the fact that, like, in some ways, literature can only do so much. And maybe that has something to do with your impulse to want to burn everything down. And that, like, this story goes on to be in Best American Short Stories 2007.
Yeah.
Right? A very notable honor. And yet, like, what has it done? Right? And maybe that's the pessimist in me, right?
Yeah.
Suggesting, there is change possible, I suppose. All right, I'm too pessimistic now. But right, like, one can only do so much.
Yeah.
Well, I think the thing that literature answers, right, is that, like, any individual that reads the story has the opportunity to enact that change.
Yeah.
Right. And so maybe regardless of the ending, whether they're saved by the hot air balloon from nowhere or everything burns down, right? Like, you are still put in that position where, as a reader or any reader, right, you have to think, or you're meant to rethink your thoughts on how you think about others, how you interact with others, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing that happens. And I am skeptical, I think, about saying literature's only answer is what I just mentioned.
Yeah.
In that, there's no one answer, and there's no real answers to anything, in fact. To get existential for a moment, in that, right, like, we can think things through forever and ever and come up with different ideas and possibilities and theories and so on, while we're still living in the world that we inhabit now, which contains strictures of all kinds and thoughts of all kinds about different types of people. And so, it's a continuing conversation that we have, and maybe isn't that the most important thing?
Yeah, I think that's right. Like, that's for my desire to burn it down, right? Like, the fact that it ends on a kind of elegant version of the aristocrats joke is that, like, I feel that possibility opened up, right? Like, even as, like, I know what I just watched was, like, a lot of confusing nationalism and racism and, like, unnecessary violence and cartoon grotesqueness that, like, it opens up for me anyway, and I do like that about it in the end.
Yeah, this is all interesting to me. I think you're so right that, we were joking about forgetting the poet's nationality. That's so much the point of this story, that the way that we label and define people, I think this is important context, is arbitrary. And, the story is so much playing with stereotype and the way we joke about groupings, but also, it's playing with just trying to put a nationality, put a defining characteristic on someone, and have that be their character, and breaking it down in all these different ways. I think part of why the ending works for me is maybe that I'm the kind of reader where I very much will take a literal scene as literal first. So for me, like, my mind didn't go to, what is Kesey telling me about the balloon? How is the balloon an answer to what he's working out with characters and defining characteristics and the absurdism of this story? Like, for me, the balloon was the image of the balloon, and it was the first time that I got to see something very clearly, and something I didn't expect. So it had this quality that really reminds me of a clip that I was shown in college. We were talking about humor. I'm blanking on the director's name. The person who directed Amelie. Maybe we're all going to blank on this, but that's not important. So the clip is just, you see 3 little boys watching someone with big clown shoes standing at the top of the stairs, right? And there's a bucket near his feet, and before you even have time to think it, your mind's already expecting him to fall, I think. But instead what happens is he reaches into the bucket and ends up making bubbles with it. And I think that's what this story does to me at the end. Like, I'm expecting one more gag, especially because of the joke structure, and I'm liking that, and I'm feeling okay about that.
Yeah.
But instead, it takes me to this other transcendent space. I think I'm with you that when you're looking at that space symbolically, that I would love for him to get a little deeper and explore identity, and give me something more. I don't know how he would do that, but
Yeah.
Why not be greedy as a reader?
Yeah, I think in the end that's one of the things about the story, right? That all other things aside, ultimately the story does do what it wants to do, and it's creating a very particular type of world that we've come to say this in different ways, right? Like there is the sort of absence of interiority of many of the characters. There's the sort of external qualities that we see of the characters, but also I think all of us at one time or another have sort of compared this to a filmic thing. So I thought as we move toward the end, that we could talk about that filmicness, that kind of frank presentation of objects, but also who, right, like as Matthew noted, there's a quality of the specificness of the airport, but also, right, like the things that the bar runs out of they're not necessarily things that you see or don't see with some kind of specificity. It's the absence of a thing or the genericness of the thing. And so I think we imagine those things a little bit differently on an individual level, right? Like it's got that kind of Hemingway quality of using the word tree as opposed to even oak tree. It leaves each person open to their own reading of some of that genericness. For that reason, all of those reasons collectively, I'm wondering thinking about if any of you have thoughts on who you would like to direct the film of Roy Kesey's Wait.
Well, two directors immediately come to mind. One, because I was reminded of him while reading this story. Part of how I came to the idea this was like a joke, in my mind, was it reminded me a lot of the structure of a Woody Allen joke that I really love about Hemingway and Fitzgerald. I'll let you look it up because it's great, but he repeats things about Hemingway punching people in the nose and the Fitzgeralds doing the things they do, and through the repetition, it really surprises and makes me laugh. So, I mean, I think Woody Allen could bring something funny to this, but I think the director I'm leaning toward is Altman. I think he does so well with big casts. I think he'd make this a visual extravaganza and really dig into the absurdity of the story. And I think he has a real capacity for transcendent moments like you get at the end, or a real sensitivity to that. I think Nashville is so absurd throughout, but I end up feeling very similarly to the way I feel at the end of this story. So yeah, I think Altman's my vote.
My initial vote was going to be Cronenberg. Because Cronenberg's interrogation of violence over the last several decades has been really interesting to me. However, I think I'm going to land on Wes Anderson as like this story was like written by Wes Anderson for a Wes Anderson movie, because his movies are very absurd but deal in violence and how people are perceived. And so I think my final answer is Wes Anderson.
Yeah, I feel like you stole mine. I thought a lot about Tarantino, who I've got notably mixed feelings about, and David Lynch, but I got really hung up thinking of this is a certain version of Darjeeling Limited or something, and really kind of imagine that with lots of that kind of bright monochrome thing about it. And
just think of the airport room that he would create.
Fucking gorgeous. Fucking gorgeous. On that note, Guys, thanks for sitting down and talking with me about Roy Kesey's Wait. As always, you can find us at oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1. And until next time, friends.